Yeah, we don't want to do anything to scare your children. That's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to scare anybody.
What is the location?
Walk away from there, okay?
Welcome to Stolen From Me on YouTube. The San Francisco Witch Killers. Michael Bear Carson was actually born James Carson in 1950 in Oklahoma, and he was from a really loving family. As a child, James actually faced quite a difficult time. He had a rare bone disorder and was on bed rest for several years. He spent his time just reading books after books after books. As James got older, he actually became more and more rebellious, and he just wanted to experiment with anything he could, which meant the whole sex, drugs and rock and roll scene. Now, moving on to the early 70s, he actually met his future wife and mother of his child, Lynn, at college. They married after 2 years and then later had their daughter called Jennifer. But before this, Lynn and James would go on protests together and lived quite a bohemian hippie lifestyle. James was a family man and he would stay at home and take care of his daughter. He would sell pot on the side, but Lynn actually went to work as a teacher. Jennifer loved being cared for by her dad. He'd play games with her, braid her hair, and even go on memorable trips together. Even though James was a really good dad and husband, cracks were starting to show through. He would make comments such as, "Oh, I could kill him," even though a lot of people do say this in anger. But Lynn started to feel a little uncomfortable, and on one occasion he actually reached for his gun and he ran to the front door. Lynn managed to grab the gun off him. He started to show more signs of becoming unstitched. His drug use became more frequent and less recreational. Lynn tried her best to rationalise her husband's behaviour, but she struggled herself with James's behaviour and kind of tried to make it normalised, but she was having such a tough time with it. The more drugs he did, the more dangerous he actually became. Now, Jennifer went on to explain that her dad never felt like he belonged anywhere and he needed something to believe in. He started to show signs of anti-social tendencies and he began to hate everyone. James believed sort of certain people from the government should be killed, and he also believed that in his younger days that he could kill people with his own mind, and he really did believe this. Lynn would end up taking Jennifer and leaving James. He was spiralling completely out of control and he once threw a glass which actually hit his daughter's knee, and this was the last straw for Lynn. She packed up and left for their own safety. This would lead James to meeting the woman that would end up writing his future. Suzan Barnes. She was born in 1941 in Arizona, and she came from a very privileged family. She didn't want for nothing as a young child. She did, however, believe that she had psychic powers, and she didn't really get on well at school, and also she didn't make friends very easy. Now, she did go on to meet a young man and marry him and have 2 sons together. But although this man would give her anything she wanted, it just never was enough for Suzan. So Suzan went on to find free love and mind-changing drugs, and then eventually spirituality. Now Suzan decided to take or be part of the Islamic religion, and this is where she changed her name as part of Allah from Suzan to Suzan with a Z. So instead of Susan, she would then change it to Suzan. I bet she looked back at that and think, that was my biggest achievement yet. Well done, Suzan. Well done. So she followed this religion, but really she wasn't following it at all, and she rewrote the whole religion kind of thing to her own religion. Now, I'm not a religious person, so I'm not going to pretend that I know about all these different religions because I do not have any religion. And then Suzan, it's actually said that Suzan went on to bed up to 150 of her son's friends. Now, I don't know why they say bed, because if that was her son's friends and they were still at school, this is illegal and it would surely be rape or assault. I couldn't find anywhere where she'd got in trouble for it, and I really don't understand why nothing came of it for such a large number as well. I know it doesn't matter if that was 1 or 150, but nothing I can see happened about any of it. So Susan's husband and Susan decided to split up, and this would lead Susan to meet James. Susan was throwing a party which James attended, and they instantly had a spark like a firework going off. James moved in with Susan to her house, and they were basically inseparable. And Susan said to James, "Isn't your name Michael?" And James replied, "No, it's James." And then she said, "No, I think it's Michael, after the archangel who kicked Satan out of heaven." I actually wanted to say but then. Anyway, so from now on, James is known as Michael. And Susan would explain to Michael that she was a psychic, and he believed every single little thing she said. They believed that in a past life they were lovers, and Michael loved being around Susan. Not only was Susan like a drug to him, and very addictive at that, she also loved the same things as him, like free love and taking drugs together. And this is where they start to lose reality. Michael was happy with Susan, and even though he was still a father and had responsibilities to fulfill, Jennifer, his daughter, would actually go and visit Susan and her dad in joint custody. Now, Jennifer has a memory of her dad being a very loving father at home, remember? And braiding her hair. In reality now, things were different. Jennifer was 4 years old and left to fend for herself when she would visit Michael and Susan's house. They would spend their time taking drugs, and Michael and Susan would be out cold on the bed many times, and Jennifer had to fend for herself. Now, their radical views on religion, and they would often talk about extremist religious beliefs. Susan would mostly instigate all this, and Susan actually believed that she had a vision from God, and demons were sent to kill her. Now, Jennifer's safety was now starting to become at risk. Michael and Susan believed that they were witch slayers. Jennifer recalls, as a young child, asking her father to rub her back, just like Mummy did. Now, Michael left the room for some reason, and Susan took over. Susan whispered into this 4-year-old child's ear that she was going to hell and she was a demon, and then she went on to scratch Jennifer's back, which left open wounds. When Jennifer got home to her mum, she told her, and she said that her back was hurting, so her mum lifted up her top and saw these marks. Her mum would contact the family, and then when Lynn actually phoned up Michael to find out what the hell was going on, it came clear that he wasn't the same man as she knew. Lynn now believed that they were in immediate danger from Michael and Susan. Lynn reached out to everyone she could possibly think of, including family and authorities, and they all just shut Lynn down like she was just some crazy ex-wife. Lynn's worst fears became a reality. She got a phone call from Michael saying that him and Susan was leaving for a trip, and he was coming in an hour to collect his daughter Jennifer. Lynn had no clue what to do, so she did what she thought was right, and she fled to Southern California. This is where her and Jen lived to get away from Susan and Michael. She did what she had to do to protect their daughter, like any mother would. Michael and Suzanne left for their trip, and they were filled with hallucinogenic drugs and going on about their own interpretation of their religion. Now, on their travels, they met a girl called Karen, and this was at a party in the hippie district of San Francisco. Karen was really interested in their way of life, and she found that they needed a place to stay, so she invited them to stay at her basement. Karen was described as a vulnerable young woman who liked interest in people, and Suzan and Michael would speak about meditation and psychic behaviour. Karen was fascinated by Michael and Suzan and their way of life. Suzan then started to have visions of witches and devils. They were trying to intimidate her and Michael, and they would need destroying. Suzan then told Michael that Karen was a witch and she needed to be killed. 23-year-old Karen Barnes was laying face down in a pool of her own blood. She was stabbed 13 times in the face and the neck, and she had severe blunt force trauma to the back of her head. It did not appear to the police that Karen had been mugged or raped, and there was no knife at the scene. However, on the walls of the basement, one woman's name was writ on the wall, and that was Suzanne with a Z. And lots of religious writing all over the walls. In 1981, the police launched a murder investigation. Karen's friends and family were all interviewed, and her friends told the police that 2 drug-dealing hippies lived in her basement for the past month, but they said that their names were Michael and Suzan Bear. And Karen's parents later said, no, it's not Bear, it's actually Carson. Although the police had no leads really to go on, they kind of put this case on the back burner. It was still open, but they couldn't find anything else to go on. March the 23rd, 2 weeks after Karen's murder, Suzan and Michael arrived in southern Oregon. They found a little shack that they could stay in on Allah's Mountain. Michael and Suzan actually believed that they were sent here now to rid the world of witches and demons, and they wanted to kill as many witches as possible. But what this really meant was Suzan believed that she wanted everyone dead who became a threat or she was jealous with. That's what really happened. Michael needed to leave the shack as they actually ran out of food and drugs, and they couldn't stay there without any supplies whatsoever, so Michael headed off and Suzan decided to stay in the shack. Now, Michael would actually be gone for a couple of weeks, and on his return, Suzan would be completely freaked out. She was starved and had no drugs in her system at all, and this escalated her visions in she was seeing witches every time she looked anywhere. They were just all over the place. Now, on the 22nd of May, 1981, they managed to hitch a ride off a man. And the man actually said to the couple that he had a treehouse that they could stay in. But the owner of the land would soon have a change of heart. Now, he wanted to evict Suzan and Michael, and he tried to do this but didn't really go down well. So they would end up robbing the owner and stealing his gun and then set fire to his house. Over the next year, Michael and Suzan would be travelling around continuously until they actually landed a job on a cannabis farm, and that was in May in 1982. Now, the farmer actually described them both as loonies and said that they wasn't even fit to work on a farm. Now, the farmer's friend, Clark Stevens, would actually have an altercation with the two. He believed that they didn't work properly on the farm and this annoyed him. Now, a couple of days passed and Suzan actually told Michael that Clark actually touched her and that he needed to be taken care of. Michael went on to shoot Clark and set fire to him. May 17th, 1982. The owner of the farm called the police. A dog had been playing with what they thought was a ball, but it was later discovered to be a skull. Suzan and Michael headed to California. They came across a search and rescue team which made them completely panic. The search and rescue team was actually looking for a lost hiker, but they didn't know this. So this caused them to panic, drop the bags and split up. Now the police actually found their bags and searched them. They found some weed and an ID badge and a manuscript, which actually Michael wrote, and the script was titled Cry for War. It was described as an anarchist battle cry. Michael wrote the script that the public figures that was actually in the script, they all needed to be assassinated. And it's believed there was like Ronald Reagan in there, Johnny Carson, and they all needed to be assassinated because they had something like 6 letters in their name. Now, the ID badge of the man who they believed was Michael stole his ID a few weeks previous. Now, the police had fingerprints on the script and it came back to be Michael and Suzan. And they were actually wanted for Clark's death. So the police wanted them to bring him in for questioning. The Secret Service was now interested in the case due to the script and all the public figures on it. Michael and Suzan, they split up, like I said, and headed in different directions. Now, Michael was later pulled over by the police and taken in for questioning. Now, they believed that Michael was a rapist that they were looking for. And even though the police officer did pat Michael down, the police officer actually missed the gun that killed Clark. Now, while Michael was in the back of the police car, he actually hid the gun down the seat. And then Michael ended up being questioned for an hour and, they never found the gun. Now, because Michael actually gave his name as the ID that he stole, and a picture of him was taken by the police and sent to the rape victim to see if he was the positive match who actually attacked him, that came back negative, so the police actually had no reason to keep him. But then the police officer actually searched his car and found that the gun was actually tucked down the seat, and then they done an ID which came back Richard Aragut. I think I'm saying that wrong. And the ID to the picture was not matching up because they had a positive ID that was Michael Carson, and the ID that he gave was Richard. So they then put out a call for Michael Carson. Now, the police sent the gun off for testing and it came back the same gun that killed Clark. This was a week after Clark's death. Now, Michael and Suzan were now reunited. They both stayed at a friend's house, but the friend, like many others, wanted them to leave. So Michael repaid their kind gesture of letting them stay by stealing their gun. On the road again, they were both trying to hitch a ride. A truck pulled up. Instantly, Suzan knew. She said to Michael, "It's a witch. This person needs to be killed." Michael and Suzan climbed aboard the truck. John was listening to music. Suzan hated the music, and she said that John touched her leg. This meant that Michael and John would have a fight. But the struggle was hard. John fought for his life. And Michael didn't seem to care who was watching. There was a lot of witnesses. The struggle went out into the open and witnesses phoned the police. Michael killed John. But the witnesses described the two and the truck. Just before Suzan got in the truck and crashed it, Michael and Suzan fled into the woods and the police ended up catching up with the two and arresting them. The two was placed into custody. At the trial, Michael admitted killing Clark and John, but said it was in self-defense on both accounts. Suzan didn't speak in court or to her lawyer. So basically, when Suzan was not speaking to anybody, Michael was having a little panic attack about the case not being covered enough. Once the papers got involved, he confessed to the San Francisco murder 2 years ago, which was Karen. And this is where Michael agreed on a deal. He would confess to the murder of Karen if the two of them could have a press conference. They didn't see that they did anything wrong at this press conference, and they actually spoke, ranting on about catching witches and killing them, and this was their duty, for 6 hours. They didn't see they were wrong in any way. They believed that they were actually doing God's work by killing these witches. Now, Suzan really did believe that Karen put a curse on her, and Suzan's looks were fading because of the curse. This is why Karen had to die. On the 23rd of October 1983, they were both deemed fit to stand trial. 1984, in June, the trial of Karen Barnes began. July the 2nd, 1984, they were both convicted of 25 years to life for the murder of Karen. Later, in 1985, they would again be sentenced to the same sentence for first-degree murder of Clark Stevens. And then, further, they would be sentenced in 1987 for the same sentence for the murder of John. Michael and Suzan are eligible for parole in 2038. Michael will be 87 and Suzan will be 96. Michael still wrote to Suzan. And Suzan and Michael are described by Jennifer as dynamite and the match, Suzan being the match. Jennifer later stated that for 10 years of her life was took up through court proceedings until she was 19, and Jennifer did go visit her dad, mainly to have closure. But this soon became clear that the man she remembered as a loving father as a small child was gone. Jennifer has made numerous attempts on her own life. This is because of what had happened. And she lives still in trauma and the fear that one day Michael will be released. Michael once realised that Jennifer didn't really want to connect with him at all and had campaigned for him and Suzan to stay in prison. Once he realised all this, he wasn't pleasant in his letters anymore to his daughter. He actually became aggressive. Jennifer and John's brother both agree that if Suzan and Michael were ever to be released, they would most certainly kill again. Michael was up for parole actually in 2015, but he would actually withdraw his own sort of application for parole because he had no remorse whatsoever for what he'd done to these people. And Suzan was just flat-ass turned down for parole. And obviously, like I said a minute ago, they're up for parole in 2038. I think it's 2038. So this was the case of the San Francisco witch killers. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I can't wait to see you next week.
No one wants to go to jail for things.